provocative. Oh. Can I live up to this? I don't know. It's great to be here for this special evening organised by the World Monuments Fund Britain and featuring our speaker Oliver Cox. And the subject, of course, is Lancelot Brown, the man latterly known as Capability, for good reason. And this year, in case you didn't know, I'm sure you do, is the tercentenary of his birth, and there are lots of celebratory events. Now, Oliver is a really original thinker in this area, and I think his talk is going to be one of the most imaginative and freewheeling events occurring across this year of celebration. So the structure of the evening, as John has indicated, is a short talk from me, then Oliver's talk, then the Q&A, and questions from you in the audience. So please, if you have any thoughts as we're talking and thinking about Brown, hold those thoughts and save it up for that part of the evening. So I've been asked to set the scene for Oliver's talk, which ranges, I've seen the text, and it ranges far and wide across Brown's work, and also, crucially, its reception in the 18th century and also right up until the modern period. We've got a treat in store with lots of unexpected connections arising, which really bring Brown up to date and into the modern era, which is where I think he belongs. Just enlarge upon that a little bit. I mean, I was very gratified to have been invited by John Darlington to introduce Oliver this evening and provide some context, because my own period of special interest in garden history is the first half of the 18th century, that is BC, before Capability. Because there is a little bit of a divide, really. It's a wonderful divide in garden history. Really, Brown starts in about 1750. It's really, really easy. And everything changes with Brown for various reasons. But it does mean that the people working in the field tend to either concentrate on the early 18th century or Brown and the late 18th century. And I have to say there are an awful lot more of us in the early 18th century. And I think partly that's because it's a bit easier. So as I say, I was gratified because some of the things that I've said or written about Brown in the past have caused me to feel like a bit of a Brownian bogeyman figure for all the Brownians out there, who are, of course, all my good friends and colleagues as well. This came home to me last year when English Heritage, as it was, got in touch about a research impact review, wonderfully named document, which is very useful, actually. They put together ahead of this year of tercentenary celebrations. It's online, you can read it, it's a good document, a summary of the reactions to Brown's work in his own time and right up to the present day. And would I mind, they said, if they quoted me in this document? Of course not. I said, quote away. So the report came out, and it contained a paragraph which began, recent research, while continuing to acknowledge the importance of Brown in the development of landscape design, has tended to reduce the extent of his preeminence. Oh. The report then goes on to quote something from Tim Mole, professor from Bristol University, emeritus now, questioning Brown's originality. And it goes on, Richardson has gone further, dismissing the landscapes created by Brown as inherently meaningless, whilst acknowledging their commercial success and at the same time identifying the early 18th century landscape garden of William Kent and his contemporaries as the greatest art form ever to have been devised in the British Isles. It concludes, a growing interest among scholars in the first half of the 18th century has thus, to some extent, triggered a backlash against Brown. Well, I did write those words, and I did okay all of that before publication. I don't interfere when people want to put my words in documents and so on, so I'm sort of guilty as charged. And I have also deployed the phrase pastoral monotony in relation to Brown. But I would argue that it's a mistake to look upon those comments and the comments of others in this vein as simply and merely pejorative. It's not just a backlash. Landscape gardens in the first half of the 18th century were often, usually, the work of the landowners themselves. People like Charles Hamilton at Paynes Hill in Surrey, if you've been there. They tended to be highly personalised, artistic and political statements. Where any professionals were involved, they were really helping to realise these intensely idiosyncratic personal visions. So you can think of William Kent at Stowe and Rousham, for example. And many people love those gardens for their idiosyncrasy, their verve, and their ambition. But by the 1750s, all of that was rather old hat. The politics had largely drained away from gardens, and the idea of creating gardens filled with landscape episodes replete with classical, Gothic, chinoiserie, and other stylistic allusions, all with specific meanings embedded in them, was frankly passé. So Brown was the new man. And I suspect his design ideology, or rather his non-ideology, was met with a sense of palpable relief by many of the aristocrats, who could just ask Mr. Brown to do his thing. That is, to make an estate work aesthetically and economically, without feeling that they had to somehow declare themselves as part of the package. So in some ways, Brown was quite a recognisable modern figure, which is why I think he tends to be an inspiration to many landscape designers today. I've just written a piece for The Telegraph, it hasn't appeared yet, all about this, the way he has influenced designers from Jim Corner in New York, who designed the High Line, Professor Yu in China, who's probably the most successful landscape designer in the world, Kate Cullity in Australia. Brown has real meaning for them and is a real inspiration in a way that the designers of the early 18th century, my guys, as it were, are kind of irrelevant to them. So although I try to avoid anachronisms generally, I think one could look upon Brown as an entrepreneur with a brand. Not that he went across the country just stamping his brand. His skill was in creating places with their own unique feeling. You don't get a sense he was just doing the same thing again and again. You could say he was like a sort of James Dyson, perhaps, in that he was a brilliant technician, particularly in the area of water, which is always a terrible trap for landscape architects. Everything goes wrong with water. But he was also shrewd, like Richard Branson. He manipulated his own image. The Brownian scholar John E. Phibbs has done work on this, on the way he insisted on being depicted in portraits, dressed up as a sort of farmer. And he never published anything. He was also brilliant at client relations, by and large. So while it's true there are no stories or multiple meanings embedded in Brown's landscapes, there is the one big story or meaning, which is the pastoral ideal of England, and a house set in its own decorous landscape, and an estate which functions economically and aesthetically. So when I suggest that Brown's landscapes are essentially meaningless, I don't mean he was unjustified, unwise, or complacent in following that route. Brown's landscapes are not a vessel for other people's ideas. They are the thing itself. The paradox, of course, is that Brown's intention was to make himself, as a designer, invisible. His mature landscapes look as if they have always been there. And setting that in train 250-odd years ago was all part of his skill, his capability. That's why this year is such an important one, because here we're talking about an artist whose work, underpinned by huge technical knowledge, is effectively hidden in plain sight. And perhaps that's why relatively few garden historians have tried to tackle Brown. It's very surprising given his magnitude in the landscape history canon. But the condescension of history doesn't quite square with Brown, who, as I say, always feels modern somehow. So, for some revelation on that, I'm going to hand over to Oliver, Dr. Oliver Cox now, who will, I think, be familiar to many of you as a landscape historian with an original and a piquant vision. Oliver is currently Knowledge Exchange Fellow with Oxford University's Thames Valley Country House Partnership Project, which he instigated. He's a trustee of Compton Verney and a member of the Arts Council's designation panel. He's published widely on Gothic Revival architecture, landscape gardening, and patriotism, and is currently writing From Addison to Austin, a short guide to the long 18th century. Tonight, the topic of his lecture is Clumps and Concrete, 300 Years of Capability Brown. Over to you, Oliver.
Thank you. Thanks, Ted.